Hello and welcome. This is Matthias 76. Together, we are decoding the deception. Together, we find ourselves as a nation and as a world in the midst of very perilous times. Heinous attack has taken place over in Israel. Details of that are being played out in the news day by day, and the trumpets are being sounded. The drumbeat of war is ringing loud, and I just thought it would be advisable, it would be prudent for us to stop and think. In these emotional times, thinking is often left out of the equation. We don't want to back up and look at the big picture. When we do, when we ask some questions, because we're looking at the big picture, some question our character, our intelligence, our patriotism. But I believe it is my considered opinion. After years of study, years of research, I have been a student of history all my life. And as an adult, over the past 10 years, I have been forced by things I have seen to re-examine history, to study history again, and to look at it with a fresh eye. And when I do that, one of the big takeaways is when the drumbeat of war is sounding, I believe we need to stop and ask some questions. So we're just going to do a high-level look at history and patterns in history. The title of this video is How They Keep Tricking Us into War. Now, I'm going to recommend a resource. There are many resources that I have used, countless resources I have used in my own research throughout the years, but one that is readily available and condenses all of the information that I'm going to share today, takes all of that and presents it very well, very intelligently, and much, much more, is this book, 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw, Solving Political, Cultural, and Spiritual Riddles Past and Present by James Perloff. James Perloff is an excellent author. I've read everything he has written. I trust him. I have vetted him. So we're going to take a stroll through history, if you will. We will start with the Spanish-American War. Many of us are not even familiar, perhaps, with the Spanish-American War. The big motto, the slogan of the Spanish-American War was Remember the Maine. We sent the Maine to Cuba, and it was there in the harbor, and there in the harbor it blew up. And tensions had been rising between the United States and Spain. To this day, historical examinations, looking at the wreckage, everything else, no one knows why the Maine blew up, but the Maine blew up. And there was a drumbeat sounded for war. History, Remember the Maine, February 15th, 1898. William Randolph Hearst, who owned the major newspapers, enough of them in the United States, made it his mission to get us into this war. Now, a reasonable examination of history says, why would Spain want to intimidate the United States with its all-steel navy? They still had wooden ships. They did not stand a chance against the United States. But America, the main politicians, the main voices in the media wanted war, and war is what they got. Teddy Roosevelt, future president of the United States, got to ride up San Juan Hill and win that victory. America was victorious. 2,446 Americans died. Those in power, those in the know, made money. There were profits to be made. The map of the world was redrawn. Cuba became a property of the United States. And as a bonus, way out in the Pacific, we got the Philippines. That took a little bit more skirmishing, but we were able to take over the Philippines, make them a territory. Those who fought received medals. That's what you get when you fight. You get ribbons, you get medals. That is your reward. And those in power got what they wanted. But again, 2,446 Americans died. Let us go on to World War I and the Lusitania. The Lusitania was being used. It was a passenger ship, a large passenger ship. It was being used to carry material of war, munitions, ammunition, bombs, explosives to the British. The Germans made it plain. That's a warship. Send it across again and we'll sink it. They took out ads in the newspaper. President Woodrow Wilson saw to it that those ads were pulled by all but one newspaper. He didn't get to them in time. They were saying, don't sail on this ship, we'll sink it. As it crossed the Atlantic, right when it reached the point where they knew the wolf packs of submarines of the Germans were the thickest, this man, Winston Churchill, that's a young Winston Churchill, he was Lord of the Bath, that's what they call the head of the Navy, called back the ships that were there to escort the Lusitania through the submarines. He called them back, the destroyers that would protect it from the submarines, and the Lusitania was sunk. The papers told everyone all about it. It was sunk by a submarine, 1,260 dead. It was torpedoed off the Irish coast. It was a terrible, terrible, horrible thing. But in the long run, and this is a very short purview of this, in the long run, Winston Churchill, Woodrow Wilson, the British, the Americans, they got what they wanted. They got war. 2 years of the United States fighting in this war there in the trenches of Europe. Total casualties for that war, all told, around 21 million. 8.5 million soldiers, 13 million civilians. But just here for these United States, 116,516 Americans died, 204,002 wounded. Something I highly recommend. You can find it on my website, decodingthedeception.com. General Smedley Butler, look at his chest, medals all over it. General Smedley Butler, the most highly decorated combatant in World War I, came away from the whole thing sick to his stomach, especially when he saw what had gone on in the United States with the profiteering, with the sacrificing of young men for the sake of money and political gain at the behest of the bankers and the industrialists. And he wrote a pamphlet. It's only 14 pages. Go to my website, decodingthedeception.com, go to our resource center, documents, and just type in War is a Racket, and there it is, 14 pages, and you can read it. Everything it says is still germane today. And what he points out oh so clearly is that those in power made money. The map of the world, especially Europe, was redrawn, and those who suffered and survived, their pay, their reward was bits of ribbon and trinkets of metal, and shell shock is what they called it in World War I. We call it by something else, PTSD. And he documents in that pamphlet, War is a Racket, how that was hidden from the American people. We continue our advance through history, and we come to World War II, and what had worked for the Spanish-American War. Do you see the pattern here that I'm pointing out? What had worked for the Spanish-American War, remember the Maine. What had worked for the First World War and the Lusitania, give us an atrocity, give us something about which we can be outraged and over which the media, then it was the newspapers, could stir up the hearts and minds and emotions of the people, and you can get what you want. Well, Teddy Roosevelt's cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, knew that full well. He had learned that lesson. Interestingly, both Roosevelts were politicians from New York. Both served as Secretary of the Navy. Just a point of trivia. In this book, Day of Deceit, The Truth About FDR and Pearl Harbor, Robert B. Stennett, himself a veteran, serving in the United States Navy in World War II, documents that the same kind of trickery went on with World War II, but it was about Pearl Harbor. In the book, it's page 246, this document can be found. He got it through the Freedom of Information Act. It's called the McCollum Memorandum, a recommendation made to Roosevelt on 7 October 1940 of how to goad the Japanese into attacking us. It's an 8-point plan, and they followed it studiously, and that they intended for the Japanese, and it sounds atrocious. It sounds absurd. Read the book. You can read a short synopsis of it in 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw. They goaded the Japanese into it. They knew exactly what was happening. They left Pearl Harbor wide open to attack, and then left those who were in charge, the general and the admiral who were there, left them to hold the bag on all of it. Why? Because this man wanted us in World War II. He believed it necessary, and I'm not even going to go into the real reasons he thought that it was necessary, but that's why we goaded the Japanese into attacking us. And in that book by Robert B. Stennett, more things than what I have laid out here are documented. Literally, the documents obtained from the Government Freedom of Information Act, all laid out. We had broken their code. We followed their spies around on Oahu, the island where Pearl Harbor was. We knew it was coming. It's all documented. FDR got what he wanted. This horrible attack, tremendous loss of life, so many ships sunk, so many sailors, airmen, and servicemen killed, and he got to make his speech about the Day of Infamy. That's why Stennett calls it the Day of Deceit. How many casualties in Pearl Harbor? 2,335, but actually total with civilians 2,403. World War II, big picture, and the story for the whole war isn't a whole lot different. Total casualties somewhere in the vicinity of 80 million. No one can be sure because so many died. But money beyond belief was made by the industrialists, by the bankers. We were stirred up and we were outraged. And once again, the bankers, the industrialists, the profiteers, all made vast fortunes, and 405,339 Americans died. 670,846 were wounded. My grandfather was in this war, was in North Africa, Italy, and was even at the Battle of the Bulge, serving as a doctor in field hospitals. I don't know how many of those 670,000 he saw. And again, the young men got bits of ribbon and trinkets of metal, and in a huge way, the map of the world, the entirety of the world, was redrawn. And we got something that had been a desired outcome of the First World War, we got as a result of the Second World War. They wanted World War I to result in the League of Nations. Well, World War II got us the United Nations. And again, I'll say, go read this book, 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw. It's $19 paperback on Amazon. We'll move on to Korea. The North Koreans invaded South Korea. Most people in America didn't even know where Korea was. The details of how that war got started take a little bit more time. It involved a great deal of subterfuge and misappropriations of arms that went to China instead of to whom they were supposed to go to, worked out by Americans in positions of power. And we got the Korean War, and the United States got to have the United Nations participate. This was the United Nations police action. Now, there was a minuscule amount of troops from other nations, but it was considered the United Nations war, even though the United States paid for it and did most of the fighting and dying. And speaking of fighting and dying, General Douglas MacArthur on the left had all but won the war and was ordered by the man, then President Harry S. Truman, to retreat and not win the war. MacArthur couldn't believe it. To cover the whole thing, Harry S. Truman said that MacArthur wanted to drop nukes, etc., made him look unstable, and had him removed from his position. The war ended up in a stalemate. It's still that way today. That is why Kim Jong-un is there today. 54,246 Americans died. 92,134 were wounded. But the same evil crew, they made money. Once again, the map of the world was redrawn. Once again, those who fought and suffered and died, my great uncle was in this war, was there at the Yalu River when MacArthur was told he couldn't win and they had to retreat in the snow and the ice and the cold and the misery. And this war gets dubbed the Forgotten War. Nobody remembers Korea and the brave young men who went there and bled and died and suffered, but the people in power got what they wanted. And isn't that what it's all about? So now we turn to Vietnam, and you are probably beginning to see a pattern repeating again and again. With Vietnam, it was the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and there isn't a serious historian who exists who tries to defend the Gulf of Tonkin, that anything really happened there. It was a phantom attack on the United States Navy. Interestingly, the man in command there, it wasn't Jim Morrison of Doors fame, it was his father. You just really can't make this stuff up. But the Gulf of Tonkin is what was used to propel us into Vietnam. Another police action, massive mobilization, all kinds of Americans sent into harm's way, AirCav being a new innovation. But the war was structured, it was planned so that we wouldn't win but lose. If Korea was the war that was to teach America that you can't always win, Vietnam was the war designed, and yes, I said designed to teach us that you can't always win. America can't always win. It was to take America down off its high horse. And on the home front, everyone rallied behind the troops in World War II. Korea, everyone acted as though it didn't exist. Here in the Vietnam War, it was anti-war protests with neat photo ops with hippies giving flowers to soldiers. And look at the guy, the MP, he looks like he knows this is staged. But in the end, America lost and America left. And again, there were vast sums of money made by those who financed it, who produced the war material. Fortunes were made. The troops, they were paid with bits of ribbon and trinkets of metal, and 58,220 Americans died, 153,303 were wounded. And let us not forget Agent Orange and what it did to the troops. I knew a man who loaded these planes with Agent Orange. To say that his life and the life of his family was a medical living Hades is an understatement. And if you have the stomach for it, Google Vietnam Agent Orange babies. It's not for the faint of heart. But after this war, we swore that we would not get fooled again. The WHO helped us with that. We won't get fooled again. And I can't help but throw this in here from George Orwell. Something to think about. The further a society drifts from truth, the more the society, will hate those who speak it. And now on to 9/11. Surveys show that almost everyone has serious doubts about 9/11. The one thing pretty much everyone agrees on, what we were told isn't exactly what happened. And the deeper you go down that rabbit hole, the more convinced you will be of that. The Engineers for Truth had questions. They found answers. Pilots for Truth, they had questions. They found answers. That's all after the fact. In the moment, George W. got his day of infamy moment. He got to rally America, help work us up into a fervor as the drumbeat of war was sounded once again. The trumpets were blown from all quarters. Everyone was on the same page with this one. The newspapers, the cable media that streamed it nonstop live, day after day after day. There was so much information, images coming at us. It was all but inevitable that war would be waged. War in Afghanistan, war in Iraq, looking for weapons of mass destruction that we were promised were there and later turned out they never were there. I could go on, but I will restrain myself. What we got, along with 2 decades of war and bloodshed and expenditure, what we got was surveillance under the Patriot Act. We got Big Brother. They're now allowed to constantly look at us, listen to us, spy on us, and also, the pattern continues. The song remains the same. Vast sums of money were made. The troops, men and women, rewarded with bits of ribbon and trinkets of metal, and the Agent Orange of Afghanistan and Iraq, the burn pits, where toxic substances were burned right next to our troops pretty much all the time. Horrible health consequences that resulted, that they're still being denied that they came from this cause. And as always, plenty of PTSD to go around. We see this pattern throughout history. That's the purpose of this video. We see this pattern. This pattern should inform us. It should enlighten us. It should lead us to ask questions. When they're working on whipping us up into a frenzy of outrage, we should stop and ask questions. I've got a few, and I'm just getting started. I've got a few. How did the Mossad, the premier intelligence organization in all the world, how did they get caught completely flat-footed? How did Hamas, a bunch of thug terrorists, manage to pull one over on the Mossad? What happened to Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system that these people were able to come in from land, sea, and air? How was the vaunted, respected, feared Israeli military so woefully inept in preparation for such an attack, again, by a bunch of thug terrorists? There are more questions in my mind that probably are considered too controversial for some channels and platforms. Doesn't it tell you something when there are questions you're not allowed to ask? I recommend questions. Questions are a good thing. Questions should be encouraged, especially especially when once again, everyone is singing from the same music. It's coming in print. It's coming from the media. Do we see the pattern repeating? And if we see that pattern, I don't think we're at the point yet where we can draw any conclusions, but does not seeing this pattern lead us to believe that more questions are probably a good idea? Stopping and thinking. Reason over emotion. Stop and think. We saw it, this pattern, with 9/11. We saw it with Vietnam. The same pattern with Korea, with World War II and Pearl Harbor. Emotion, forget reason, lash out and act. The Lusitania, same pattern. And the Maine, all the way back. We're going all the way back to 1898. Should not we stop and ask questions? Now, here's the problem with questions. Questions might take us places that aren't comfortable. They might lead us to question things that we want to think are beyond question because there's stability, there's security, there's comfort in that. As we ask those questions, we're inevitably led to how, if this pattern is played out by the same people, the same forces. Notice I switched from people to forces. How can anyone be that evil? It is a complex story, and I do not think the answers are to be found here, but rather here. This is Matthias 76 Together. We are decoding the deception. God bless and have a great day.